Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. Words are like arrows, once loosed, you cannot call them back. Doran Martell said that in A Song of Ice and Fire, and so it is also quoted in the role-playing game under the Intrigue chapter. Row here of Rog Alb 1 of the channels within our YouTube RPG Brigade, recently asked for assistance on the Intrigue section of A Song of Ice and Fire, the role-playing game. The reason is because it isn't the most self-explanatory chapter or system in the world, far from it. It is a peculiar mechanic that exists, as far as I know, only in this game, at least to the structured extent that it does here. And it fits the game perfectly. Now, I haven't actually reviewed A Song of Ice and Fire role-playing game yet, or rather I recorded a review. I never uploaded it because since recording it, my opinion on the game has changed somewhat. And now I've been running it for a good number of weeks, and I think that goes to show that our reviews of role-playing games can ultimately be subjective based on our experiences of them at any given time. But anyhow, I digress. A Song of Ice and Fire is, at its heart, a game of political intrigue, where the words spoken by the nobles, the diplomats, the masters or meisters or meisters, call them whatever the hell you like, often carry a hell of a lot more weight and impact than the swords and maces wielded in battle, although try telling that to Oberyn Martell. What this means is the manipulations of one person can affect the borders all across the continent. Different lords can be put into place, different lords can be removed, marriages can end up being annulled, battles can break out, all based on the usury of one person, or several people. And this is why intrigue is a necessary system in A Song of Ice and Fire. Oh well, I suppose. It depends on your perspective. Plenty of people I've played with now have said, why don't we just roleplay it? To which I say, okay, we'll just roleplay it. Because intrigue is actually a complicated system, maybe a bit too complicated. I can see the purpose of it because of how much importance manipulation has in a game like A Song of Ice and Fire. But at the same time, it takes away that intrinsic role-playing experience that you have. When it's player versus player, you are going to definitely want a mechanic like this because no one's necessarily going to want to back down. But you could, I suppose, argue, why not just leave it up to one die roll, much as in D&D with an intimidate, bluff, or a diplomacy check, let's say, as opposed to setting up a 10-stage program for it. Still, it's not a bad system by any means, and I'm going to take you through it, partly to assist Ro here, and partly just to show you the different kind of system that exists in different role-playing games. Now, influence, or intrigue rather, is based on two core principles. You're either trying to deceive someone or persuade someone to do something. So you're either trying to persuade them something, a falsehood essentially, lie to them, or you're just trying to get them to do something. And that's what it boils down to. That's what intrigue ultimately is. It is a social combat system. Just as in Dungeons & Dragons you have, in combat, an armor class and hit points, so that if someone rolls higher than your armor class, they hit you, and then you see how much damage they do, and it deducts your hit points, and if you reach 0, you either fall unconscious or maybe even die. In A Song of Ice and Fire, you have an intrigue defense rating, which is effectively your social armor class, and you have composure, which is effectively your social hit points. So if they can exceed your intrigue defense, they will do, depending on the measure of success, they can reduce your composure. Once your composure reaches 0, they can manipulate you in a certain way. That in itself is a nice core mechanic. It's very, very simple to get your head around that part. However, it goes into more detail. For instance, you have to choose the type of intrigue that you're actually playing with. Is it a simple intrigue, a standard intrigue, or is it a complex intrigue? The differences being, Simple would be a lord talking down to one of his peasants, telling him to plough a field, or maybe someone trying to seduce someone else who is already attracted to them. So maybe Renly is trying to seduce Loras Tyrell in their tent on the eve of a battle. Now, the reason it isn't just one automatically is maybe Loras is a bit pent up, a bit tightly wound because his sister is in the camp. Who knows? So you still have to beat him down somewhat. I don't know whether that's a good use of turn of phrase or not for a situation like that. Anyway, so that's your simple intrigue. Standard intrigue may be involving more than two people. It might have more long-term consequences. A complex intrigue is more likely to be something that spans a greater period of time and has far-reaching consequences across Westeros. So, for complex intrigues, you can have things like victory points, where you actually have to participate in multiple intrigues each time you score victory points, depending on whether they come off successfully. If they do, and you score a maximum of, let's say, 3 or 4 victory points, your scheme comes to fruition. If it doesn't, it all comes tumbling down like a deck of cards, which is, again, apropos, considering that does happen in the course of the books. Now, you have to set the scene. This is step 2 of the 10-step program, because the location affects things. Let's put Renly and Loras back in the tent, or not, and because it's on the eve of a battle, it might not be the perfect location to try and seduce someone, so Loras's intrigue defense might gain bonuses as a result. So hell, you could put the same thing, Renly trying to seduce Loras Tyrell in front of a High Septon. Probably not a very good idea. Conversely, sticking with Lord Renly, you could have him trying to persuade Eddard Stark to not back Joffrey's claim to the throne, and instead back him instead, and doing it in a wholly inappropriate location, like, I don't know, a brothel. That probably wouldn't appeal to Eddard Stark's sensibilities, but then again, not much does. And he would be an awful person to get involved in one of these intrigue situations anyway, because of his unswerving idiocy. I don't mind the character of Eddard Stark by any means. He's a very enjoyable character for as long as he lasts. The problem with him is he is so almost one-dimensional, I suppose. Alright, that's doing him a disservice, and we're getting off the point. Now you get to the point of your objectives. What are you trying to achieve through this, either deception or persuasion? Are you trying to get someone to become friends with you? Are you trying to get information out of them? Are you trying to get them to perform a service for you? Or are you trying to deceive them in some way? And at this point, the player characters, write down the disposition that their character is operating at. Are they friendly, amiable, indifferent? Do they dislike each other? Are they unfriendly? Are they malicious? Or, of course, I missed affectionate. This will have various effects on the difficulty, which won't become known to the opposing party until after everything is resolved. They will either deduct or increase the role that the person is using against you. So, for instance, if Renly and Loras are affectionate towards one another, which they are, Renly is trying to persuade him to do something, so he has a persuasion modifier of +5. If he was trying to deceive him into doing something, then he would have a deception modifier of -2, because Renly thinks he's affectionate towards Loras. Loras, meanwhile, might be, I don't know, trying to seduce Bryn of Tarth, which is highly unlikely, and because they are almost intensely dislike each other, deception modifier might be increased, but persuasion modifier is going to be decreased. You see how this goes. Now, the system in A Song of Ice and Fire, just before I forget, is a dice pool system, d6s. You roll 1d6 for every single point you have in a stat, and this is based on your persuasion or your deception statistic when you're rolling it, and therefore all of these pluses and minuses do affect something tangible. So your dispositions can, of course, change during the course of the game, and you shouldn't just pick a disposition that you use because of your intentions, should I say. You want to pick the disposition that actually makes sense for the character, and the GM has the final decision on that, but you shouldn't necessarily announce it to one another. Then you take the initiative. Initiative is based on status, which is also a statistic in A Song of Ice and Fire. Essentially, a noble is almost always going to have a higher initiative than a peasant, but you still roll for it. It's just that the status roll for the noble is probably going to be something like 3 or 4d6, whereas the peasant will have 1d6, so it's more likely that the noble will go first. And then you can start using techniques that will add to various things. There's specialties you can have with the skills in A Song of Ice and Fire. For instance, there are various persuasion specialties like, bargain and seduction and intimidation and the like, and there's deception specialties as well, such as bluff and act. And so, depending on how you're intending on incorporating those techniques into your persuasion or deception, again, they may give you additions or they may give you negatives, I suppose, to the roll. Just to highlight, I will read from the book. Using techniques. Whenever you roll a deception or persuasion conflict test to influence your opponent, you may roll bonus dice from a specialty that corresponds with the technique. The difficulty is equal to your opponent's intrigue defense. A successful test influences an amount determined by the technique you used. So it defines the techniques in detail. So what is bargaining, what is convincing, what is inciting, what is intimidating and seducing and taunting, and so forth. Step 7. Role-playing. Now, again, you could argue this should have been all 10 steps rolled into one, but again, if you are affecting something of great import, you're not necessarily going to want to leave this down to the whims of the players. You may want to leave it down to the whims of the dice and the points people have put into various stats. This is where the character building actually comes into effect in a game like this, because the points you put into things like intrigue, defense, into your persuasion and deception do have a great amount of impact on the course of the game, providing the GM is willing to be malleable. And the GM can, it's up to him or her, throw in modifiers depending on how well you role play. Maybe he should be doing that in the first place. Then you start taking your actions. You choose which action you're going to take in the first exchange of intrigue. Are you going to consider? Are you going to try and fast talk? Are you actually going to try and influence, manipulate, mollify, read the target? Use a shield of reputation to bolster your intrigue defense. You effectively use one of these things and it modifies your defense or maybe even cripples the opponent's defense because you have strengthened your argument. You gauge your opponent as you take the initiative and you choose the action you're going to take. So it's a bit like, I suppose a bit like playing cards in a sense. You know what you've got in your hand, which one of these do you want to use. It's not too dissimilar to the Game of Thrones card game, if you're familiar with that. So depending on the role you're going to pick, you are going to want to use certain cards against others. But anyhow. Then we have, step 9, which is rinse and repeat. Essentially, after you have rolled against your opponent's intrigue defense, have you defeated them? If you haven't reduced them to 0, you can go through it again. And it just goes back and forth like that. The resolution, of course, being you've either been successful or you've failed. Now, that is pretty much the crux of it. You choose your action, you go to Deceive or Persuade, so Renly is trying to persuade Eddard Stark to back his claim to the throne, so he uses, let's say he uses charm. He tries to use his position and the fact that he is a handsome and charismatic leader to charm Eddard Stark into siding with him. And so he rolls a number of dice trying to beat Eddard Stark's intrigue defense, and based on their various demeanours towards each other, how they think of each other. One of them may have a bonus, one of them may not. One of them may have a drawback against defence, or whatever. I'm sorry if I'm not describing this very well, but that is essentially Intrigue. It isn't actually that complicated, it's just a bit convoluted for someone who's not done it before, I suppose, because not many games have intrigue systems, social combat systems. Most games rely on one die being rolled, and that's that. This relies on a hell of a lot of factors, including the location, the person you're speaking to, how you feel about each other, what particular specialty skills you have, what action you're taking. So again, whether you're browbeating someone, whether you are actually trying to intimidate them, or maybe even if you're trying to back up your words with the shield of your own position, essentially, saying, don't you know who I am? So, Intrigue is quite an interesting little mechanic that exists within A Song of Ice and Fire, and I hope that this video has been useful. The best way to use the system is to have both characters trying to persuade each other of something, whether it's at cross purposes or even that they may not have anything to do with each other. So while Renly is trying to seduce Loras, Loras might be trying to persuade Renly to give him a title. So in other words, Renly is going to be concentrating wholly on the seduction, and Loras is going to use the seduction to get him a position as head of the Rainbow Guard. So you can play it at cross purposes. That's the best way to do it. It's the most fun for the players, otherwise it becomes a bit like decking. By that I mean, in Shadowrun you have one character who has one special ability and he spends absolutely ages doing it. If only one person is involved in this intrigue, because it can go on, it can go back and forth until someone's composure is whittled down, because composure can be quite a high stat in this game, you will isolate the rest of the players. Get the characters involved in something like an intrigue, into intrigue, because it can be fun, it should be fun, they should be assisting each other, whether it's by manipulating other members of the opposing group, or whether it's by assisting each other by throwing in their sides of an argument, let's say. So that is my advice for you on Intrigue. I do hope this has helped. Any other questions that you've got right here, do put in the comments, and I hope this has been interesting to those of you who had no idea what Intrigue in the Song of Ice and Fire actually was. Thank you for watching.